In the shadows of Sicily's sun-baked hills, a single man's name became a symbol of pure terror. People called him the Beast. His time in power left more than 1,000 people dead. This is the true story of Salvatore Riina, the most terrifying mafia boss ever known. A man who turned betrayal into a skill and violence into a mark on history that would scare Italy for many years. Before we go down into the dark world of Riina, I want to know where you are watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Are you relaxing at night in New York? Are you beginning your day in Tokyo? Put your location and the time in the comments down below, and if you are ready for the complete, non-stop story of one of history's most brutal criminals, press that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and pass it on to anyone who enjoys true crime stories. Now, let us start where all monsters are created. In childhood, November 16, 1930, as the autumn winds swept through the Sicilian countryside, bringing with them the smell of wild fennel and old olive trees, Salvatore Riina took his first breath in Corleone, a town whose very name would later become linked with organized crime. But back in 1930, Corleone was not yet the famous place from movies. It was simply a rough, merciless mountain town where being poor was as common as the rocks that covered its roads. Corleone sits in the center of Sicily, about 50 kilometers south of Palermo, high up in the Sicilian interior. The land rises into rough hills, and the sun beats down with terrible strength. This was not the Sicily you see on postcards. There were no bright blue Mediterranean waters, no old Greek temples bathed in golden light. This was the Sicily of La Miseria, the crushing poverty that had shaped life on the island for hundreds of years. The Riina family lived in this poverty. Salvatore's father, Giovanni Riina, was a poor farmer who worked land that would never belong to him. His mother, Maria Concetta Rizzo, carried the heavy load of raising children in a place where just staying alive required an iron will. The family home was a simple building in the countryside with stone walls that gave little protection from the winter cold and summer heat. In this setting, young Salvatore, known to everyone as Toto, learned his first lessons about power and having no power. He watched his father struggle. He saw how the landowners had total control. He observed that in Sicily, true power came not from laws or the government, but from respect gained through fear. The official parts of the Italian government were far away and useless. True authority belonged to men who could command loyalty and deliver punishment. The summer of 1943 brought disaster to the Riina family. This was an event that would scar young Toto forever and perhaps push him onto his dark path. The Allied forces had landed in Sicily. Starting their attack on fascist Italy, the island became a battlefield. Unexploded bombs littered the countryside like deadly seeds waiting to explode. One September day that year, Giovanni Riina found an unexploded American bomb in the fields near their home. In those desperate times, such finds meant opportunity. The explosives could be removed and sold. The metal parts could be traded for money or food that was desperately needed. Giovanni Riina, pushed by poverty and maybe desperation, tried to take the device apart. The explosion that followed was heard all across the valley. When the dust settled, Giovanni Riina was dead. So was Toto's 7-year-old brother, Francesco. Another brother, Gaetano, was badly hurt. At just 13 years old, Salvatore Riina watched the violent destruction of his family. He saw firsthand how fast life could be ended, how fragile life really was. The effect of this event on his mind cannot be overstated. Young Toto lost his father and brother in one terrible moment. His mother was left to raise her surviving children alone in a society that showed little kindness to widows. The family sank deeper into poverty, but more than the loss of things, something changed inside Salvatore Riina's soul. Violence had taken his family. Violence, he would learn, could also be used as a weapon, as a way to gain power. Growing up in Corleone meant growing up in the shadow of the Mafia, though in those days, the group was less out in the open than it would later become. The Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, as its members called it, our thing, had old roots in Sicily. It came from a complex mix of social, economic, and political reasons. For hundreds of years, Sicily had been invaded and ruled by foreigners: Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spanish, French. The people of the island grew to deeply distrust official authority, which they saw as far away, taking advantage of them, and not truly lawful. In this empty space, other power structures grew. The Mafia started as a kind of shadow government, offering protection, settling arguments, and enforcing its own type of order. By the time Salvatore Riina was growing up in the 1940s, the Mafia had developed into a skilled criminal business. Its reach extended into almost every part of Sicilian life, but it still kept certain traditional elements that gave it cultural acceptance in the eyes of many Sicilians. Most important among these was omerta, the code of silence. Omerta was more than just not talking to the police. It was a complete way of looking at the world that told men of honor how to behave. To work with government authorities was the worst betrayal, a sign of weakness and dishonor. Real men settled their own arguments, protected their own interests, and kept their mouths shut about what they saw and heard. This code was pressed into young Sicilians from birth. It was woven into the fabric of daily life as deeply as religious devotion. For young Toto Riina, growing up in Corleone meant soaking up these values almost without thinking. The town had long been a stronghold of the Mafia. Many of his neighbors, family, friends, and even relatives worked within or alongside the organization. He learned to recognize the signs of power, who walked with confidence, who commanded respect just by being there, who others gave way to in social situations. Corleone held a special place in the geography of Cosa Nostra. While the big Mafia families were based in Palermo, the main city on Sicily's north coast, Corleone was seen as a kind of backwater. Its mafiosi were often looked down on by their more worldly Palermo counterparts as I vidani, the peasants. This disrespect would turn out to be a deadly mistake. The isolation and rough conditions of Corleone created a specific kind of criminal mind, where Palermo mafiosi might wear fine suits and keep up the appearance of respectable businessmen. The Corleonesi were tougher, more brutal, more willing to use pure violence to get what they wanted. They had less to lose and were hungry in a way that wealth could not satisfy. The years after the war brought new chances for organized crime in Sicily. The Allied occupation had broken up old power structures. The Italian government, weak and dishonest, had trouble setting up its authority. Into this chaos stepped men like Michele Navarra, a doctor who served as the mafia boss of Corleone through the 1940s and 1950s. Navarra represented the old style of mafia leadership. He was relatively careful, focused on traditional rackets like stealing cattle and controlling water rights. He was happy to be a big fish in the small pond of Corleone. But even as Navarra built up his power, a new generation was rising, hungrier and more ruthless. Among them was Luciano Liggio, a brutal and clever young mafioso who would become Toto Riina's teacher and role model. At age 19, in 1949, Salvatore Riina killed for the first time. The victim was Domenico Di Matteo, and the killing happened during a fight. The exact details of the argument have been lost to history, but the result was clear. Di Matteo died from gunshot wounds, and Riina was arrested, put on trial, and given 12 years in prison. This first murder is important for what it shows about the young Riina. At 19, he had already developed the ability and willingness to take a human life. Whether the killing was planned or happened in the heat of the moment, it proved that Riina had a key quality needed for a mafia career: the ability to kill without being frozen by guilt or fear of what would happen next. Prison in 1950s, Italy was a harsh experience, but for a young mafioso, it also served as a school to finish his learning. Behind bars, Riina would have met more experienced criminals, learned the rules and ways of Cosa Nostra, and built the connections that would help him throughout his career. Italian prisons of that time were corrupt places where the mafia's influence reached even inside the walls. Guards could be bribed, special treatment could be bought, and criminal business could be done from the cell blocks. Riina was let out in 1956, having served 6 years of his sentence. He came out tougher, better connected, and ready to fully accept the life he had seen before going to prison. He was 26 years old, with a murder conviction on his record and nowhere to go but deeper into the underworld. Upon his release, Riina was drawn to the most energetic and dangerous figure in Corleone's criminal world, Luciano Liggio. Born in 1925, Liggio was only 5 years older than Riina, but he had an almost superhuman mix of intelligence, ambition, and cruelty that made him different from others his age. Liggio had been born into poverty even worse than Riina's. He had worked as a shepherd on a farm, experiencing firsthand the humiliations of the lowest social level. This background gave him a burning anger against the established order and an unstoppable hunger for power. Unlike the older generation of mafiosi, who were happy with traditional rackets and local influence, Liggio dreamed bigger. By the mid-1950s, Liggio had gathered around him a group of young, violent, and fiercely loyal followers. Among them were Salvatore Riina, Bernardo Provenzano, and Calogero Bagarella. These were names that would eventually become linked with terror all over Sicily. Together, they formed what would become known as the Corleonesi faction, and they were about to change the Sicilian mafia forever. The tension between Liggio's group and the established boss Michele Navarra had been building for years. Navarra represented everything Liggio hated: caution, tradition, and most importantly, an obstacle to his dreams. Liggio wanted to change the sleepy criminal scene of Corleone into something more profitable and powerful. Navarra stood in his way. The conflict came to a head over control of the new healthcare system being set up in Sicily. As a doctor, Navarra had placed himself to make money from this new setup. But Liggio wanted a piece of it. More basically, Liggio simply wanted to rule Corleone, and there could only be one boss. August 2nd, 1958, Dr. Michele Navarra was driving along a country road near Corleone, coming back from a medical call when his car was suddenly sprayed with machine gun fire. The attack was quick, professional, and extremely violent. Navarra and one of his companions died in a storm of bullets. The message was clear. A new power had risen in Corleone. The killers were never officially identified, but inside the underworld, there was no doubt who had ordered and carried out the hit. Luciano Liggio had planned the murder, and among the gunmen were Salvatore Riina, Bernardo Provenzano, and Calogero Bagarella. The young lions had killed the old bull, and Corleone had a new master. For Riina, this was a crucial moment in his criminal education. The Navarra hit showed that even long-time bosses could be overthrown by superior violence and will. It demonstrated that in the Mafia, ultimate power came not from tradition or rules, but from the ability and willingness to kill. It was a lesson Riina would never forget and would use with terrible effectiveness throughout his career. Legio did not waste time building up his power over the following months and years. He methodically got rid of Navarra's supporters and possible rivals. The violence was unheard of in Corleone's recent history. Bodies turned up in ditches, in the trunks of abandoned cars, buried in shallow graves in the countryside. Some victims simply disappeared, their fate known only to their killers. This was a practice that would later be called Lupara Bianca, the white shotgun, named after the traditional Sicilian hunting weapon. It referred to murders where no body was ever found. Throughout this campaign of terror, Salvatore Riina served as one of Legio's main enforcers. He was building a reputation as a man without any mercy, someone who could be counted on to carry out any order, no matter how brutal. His fellow mafiosi began to call him a Bulva, the Beast, a nickname that captured both fear and a kind of unwilling respect. He was also known as U Kirchu, the Short One, a reference to his small height, standing only about 5 feet 3 inches tall, but no one would dare call him that to his face. Under Legio's teaching, Riina learned not just how to kill, but how to think about violence in a strategic way. Legio taught him that murder was not simply a matter of personal revenge or hot-headed anger. It was a tool of policy, a way to advance the group's goals and build power. Legio introduced his students to a way of thinking that would guide the Corleonesi for decades. Kill first, ask questions never. Where traditional mafia culture stressed talking, mediation, and carefully balancing the interests of different groups, Legio preached overwhelming force. If you thought someone might betray you, kill them before they got the chance. If someone stood in your way, get rid of them. If you needed to send a message, make it clear through spectacular violence. This way of thinking was very different from the traditional mafia approach, which focused on avoiding attention from law enforcement and keeping a certain level of public respectability. The old bosses understood that the mafia could only do well if it operated within certain limits. If it did not push the state into all-out war, Legio and his followers rejected these limits. They believed that enough violence could beat any opposition, that fear was the ultimate form of power. By the early 1960s, the Corleonesi had made themselves a force to be dealt with, not just in their hometown, but more and more in the larger world of Sicilian organized crime. They were still seen as newcomers by the powerful Palermo families, still looked down on as peasants by the sophisticated bosses of the capital. But they were peasants who were gaining power at an alarming rate, and they were just getting started. In 1974, at the age of 44, Salvatore Riina married Antonietta Bagarella. Known as Ninetta, she was the sister of Allegero Bagarella, one of Riina's closest associates from the early days with Legio, and of Luca Bagarella, who had become one of Riina's most trusted lieutenants. The marriage strengthened the ties between two of the most important families in the Corleonesi faction. By all accounts, Riina was a devoted family man. He and Ninetta would have 4 children: Giovanni, Giuseppe, Maria Concetta, and Lucia. Those who knew him in his home life described him as loving with his children, concerned about their education and well-being, a man who valued family above everything else. This normal home life existed in sharp contrast to Riina's professional life. During the same years, he was going to his children's school events and family dinners. He was ordering murders on a massive scale, planning campaigns of violence that would leave hundreds dead. This split personality is one of the most disturbing parts of Riina's character. the ability to completely separate things, to be a loving father and husband in one situation, and a merciless killer in another. The Mafia has always stressed the importance of family, but in Riina's case, this value took on a dark and ironic meaning. He would kill the whole families of rival mafiosi, including children, to stop future revenge. He would get rid of men he had known for decades, men he had shared meals with and called friends. If the needs of the organization demanded it, yet his own family remained sacred, protected by the same cruelty that destroyed others. This ability to keep two completely separate personalities may have been key to Riina's long success and effectiveness as a boss. It allowed him to function in normal society when needed, to appear as just another middle-aged Sicilian father rather than one of the world's most dangerous criminals. It also suggests a level of mental separation that borders on being a sociopath, the ability to love deeply in one area while showing absolutely no empathy in another. The early 1960s brought the first Mafia War, a bloody conflict that hinted at the even greater violence to come. The war grew out of the Mafia's expansion into cigarette smuggling and eventually heroin trafficking. As the stakes got higher, so did the tensions between different groups. The Corleonesi under Liggio's leadership used this conflict to further build their power. They made alliances with other aggressive factions and methodically targeted their enemies. During this time, Riina continued to serve as one of Liggio's main enforcers, carrying out hit after hit, each murder adding to his terrifying reputation. The first Mafia War ended in 1963 with the Sciocoli massacre triggering mass arrests that weakened many families. But the Corleonesi came out stronger, having greatly expanded their influence. Though they had not yet gained control over all of Cosa Nostra, the Palermo families remained powerful, and the Sicilian Mafia Commission, a ruling group meant to coordinate between different families and prevent destructive fights, still worked as a check on any single group's ambitions. In 1969, Riina's life changed dramatically. He and Liggio were arrested and charged with multiple murders carried out during the previous 10 years. The trial was held in Bari, on Italy's mainland, and from the government's point of view, the case seemed strong. There were witnesses, evidence, a clear pattern of criminal activity. A conviction seemed certain. But the trial showed something that would become a key feature of the Mafia's power in Sicily: the ability to influence and scare the justice system itself. Witnesses suddenly took back what they had said. Others who had worked with investigators developed amnesia on the witness stand. Some simply disappeared. The jury, subjected to a campaign of intimidation, found both Liggio and Riina not guilty. However, prosecutors were not finished. New charges were filed, new evidence was presented. Rather than face another trial, both Liggio and Riina chose to go into hiding. They were fugitives from the early 1960s, but the 1969 acquittal was only temporary. They avoided justice for decades, with Riina's hiding lasting an astonishing 30 years in total. This decision to become a fugitive was life-changing for Riina. It forced him to develop new skills: how to move through society invisibly, how to communicate through messengers, how to keep control over criminal operations while never being seen. It also freed him from certain limits. As a fugitive, he had nothing left to lose. He could follow his ambitions without worrying about keeping up a respectable appearance. Going into hiding in Sicily did not mean disappearing into some remote mountain cave. Riina stayed in Palermo and the surrounding area, living among people who knew exactly who he was, but would never betray him. He moved from one safe house to another, always one step ahead of the authorities. Protected by a network of loyal followers and by the code of omerta, that still held power in much of Sicilian society. During his time underground, Riina developed a reputation as a ghost, a phantom who could strike anywhere and then vanish without a trace. He kept iron control over his organization through a mix of personal charm, strategic brilliance, and total cruelty. His orders were passed through trusted messengers, but everyone knew they came from Curciu, the short one. The Beast of Corleone in 1974, Luciano Liggio was finally caught and put in prison. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dying in prison in 1993. With Liggio's arrest, leadership of the Corleonesi passed to Salvatore Riina and his second-in-command Bernardo Provenzano. The two men had been partners since their youth, had carried out countless murders together, and shared Liggio's dream of Corleonesi control. But Riina was the more aggressive and ambitious of the two, and he increasingly became the group's main decision-maker. Under Riina's leadership, the Corleonesi continued to grow in power and influence. They expanded their involvement in the heroin trade, which by the 1970s was making enormous profits. Sicily had become a major hub in the international drug trade. Turkish morphine base was being refined into heroin in Sicilian labs, then shipped to American markets through the infamous Pizza Connection network. The money flowing through this pipeline was huge, and the Corleonesi wanted their share. Throughout the 1970s, Riina was building the foundation for what would become his ultimate power move. He brought in talented young killers, men like Giuseppe Greco, nicknamed Scarpuzzetta, who would become one of the Mafia's most deadly assassins. He built alliances with other Mafia families, playing a long game of positioning the Corleonesi for eventual control. Riina's strategic approach was clever. He saw that many of the Palermo bosses, comfortable in their power and wealth, had grown lazy. They were making money from drugs, from construction rackets, from their traditional businesses. They had political connections that protected them from serious pressure from law enforcement. They saw no reason for major change in the Mafia structure. But Riina understood something they did not. The old order was weak. The very success and visibility of the Palermo families made them targets for law enforcement. Their political connections were useful, but also created dependencies, and most importantly, their wealth had made them soft. They had too much to lose to risk everything in a major conflict. The Corleonesi, by contrast, were hungrier, more desperate, and more willing to use extreme violence. They had less to lose and everything to gain. Riina began to identify which bosses in other families might be willing to ally with the Corleonesi, either because they were ambitious themselves or because they feared being on the wrong side when the unavoidable conflict came. In 1978, Riina ordered the murders of Giuseppe Di Cristina and Giuseppe Calderoni, bosses of Risi and Catania respectively. Both men were allies of the powerful Palermo bosses, Stefano Bontade and Salvatore Inzerillo. The main targets of Riina's eventual campaign, by killing Di Cristina and Calderoni and replacing them with Corleonesi allies, Riina was methodically isolating his main enemies, cutting away their support network before striking at the heart. These murders also served as a warning to the wider Mafia world that the Corleonesi were a force to be feared. The killings were carried out with such efficiency and boldness that they showed the Corleonesi's capabilities. The message was clear: oppose us and die. As the 1970s came to a close, the stage was set for a conflict that would make the first Mafia War look small in scale and savagery. The Sicilian Mafia Commission was dominated by three powerful figures: Stefano Bontade, who controlled key areas of Palermo; Gaetano Badalamenti, a sly veteran of many conflicts; and Salvatore Riina's representative on the commission, since Riina himself was a fugitive. The tension between these groups had been building for years. Soon it would explode into open warfare. April 23, 1981. Stefano Bontade was celebrating his 42nd birthday with friends when he got a phone call asking him to come home. He got into his Alfa Romeo and drove through the streets of Palermo. As dusk settled over the city, as he approached his home in the Villa Grazia district, a motorcycle pulled up alongside his car. The passenger on the motorcycle, Giuseppe Greco, raised an AK-47 and opened fire. The burst of automatic weapons fire shattered the evening quiet. Bontade's car swerved and crashed. When the shooting stopped, one of the most powerful bosses in the Sicilian Mafia was dead, slumped over the wheel of his bullet-riddled car. His birthday celebration turned into his funeral. The murder of Stefano Bontade marked the beginning of the Second Mafia War, the bloodiest internal fight in Cosa Nostra's history. But the war had actually been brewing for years, the result of Riina's careful planning and strategic positioning. With a single burst of gunfire, the Corleonesi announced that the old order was finished. 3 weeks later, on May 11, 1981, Salvatore Inzerillo, Bontade's closest ally and another major Palermo boss, was killed outside his girlfriend's apartment. Again, the weapon was an AK-47. Again, the killing was quick and professional. The two most powerful bosses opposing the Corleonesi had been eliminated within a month of each other, but the killing had only just begun. What made the Second Mafia War different from previous Mafia conflicts was Riina's strategy of total destruction. Traditional Mafia wars had been relatively targeted affairs. The bosses and their top lieutenants might be killed, but their families and lower-level soldiers were usually spared. This wasn't mercy, it was practicality. Leave too many survivors and you create enemies for life. Men who will seek revenge at the first opportunity. Riina's approach was different. He didn't just want to beat his enemies. He wanted to wipe them out completely. When Bontade was killed, his clan wasn't simply taken over or allowed to fade away. It was methodically destroyed. Associates, relatives, even teenagers who might someday seek revenge, all were hunted down and eliminated. After Salvatore Inzerillo's murder, his family suffered especially terrible treatment. His 15-year-old son was kidnapped, tortured, and killed for promising to avenge his father. The boy was strangled, his body cut into pieces and fed to pigs. A particularly degrading end that sent a message about what happened to those who challenged Riina. Inzerillo's brother, who had fled to New Jersey, was found dead in the United States, murdered by the American Mafia at Riina's request. Another relative's dismembered body was discovered in Germany. The message was clear. There was nowhere to hide. No distance far enough to escape Riina's reach. At the heart of Riina's war machine was a group of particularly efficient killers. Death squads that carried out murder after murder with robot-like precision. Chief among these killers was Giuseppe Greco, known as Scarpazzetta, Little Shoe, a member of the Sciocoli family who had secretly allied himself with Riina. Greco was by all accounts an exceptional assassin, an expert marksman with the AK-47. He is believed to have personally killed around 80 people during the war. He led a death squad that included Mario Prestafilippo, Giuseppe Lucchesi, Antonino Madonia, and others. This team operated with terrifying efficiency, striking targets across Palermo and the surrounding countryside, then vanishing before authorities could respond. Another key figure in the Corleonesi killing machine was Filippo Marchese, boss of the Corso dei Mille area. Marchese operated what became known as a room of death. In his Palermo headquarters, where victims were brought for questioning, torture, and finally murder. Bodies were sometimes dissolved in acid to get rid of evidence. A practice that gave rise to many legends about the depths of mafia brutality. Vincenzo Puccio was another prolific killer in Riina's service, though he missed much of the early war period, as he was in prison until 1983. Upon his release, he joined the ongoing campaign of violence with enthusiasm. Between 1981 and 1984, Sicily experienced what amounted to a low-intensity civil war. At least 400 mafia-related murders occurred in Palermo alone, with an equal number across the rest of Sicily. In addition, at least 160 people vanished without a trace. Victims of Lupara Bianca, the actual death toll was almost certainly higher, as many victims' bodies were never discovered or identified. To put this in perspective, at the height of the war, someone connected to the mafia was dying every 3 days. November 30th, 1982, provides a particularly stark illustration of the carnage. On that single day, 12 mafiosi were murdered in Palermo in 12 separate incidents. The city had become a war zone with murders occurring in broad daylight, in crowded streets, in restaurants and cafes. The authorities were overwhelmed and largely helpless. The violence extended far beyond Sicily's shores. As mentioned, Inzerillo family members were killed in the United States and Germany. Gaetano Badalamenti, the third major boss opposing Riina, only survived by fleeing Sicily before the war began. He would spend years in exile, eventually being arrested in Madrid and sent back to face charges in the United States. One of Riina's most devastating tactics during the war was his use of deception and betrayal. Many bosses had secretly allied themselves with the Corleonesi without telling their supposed friends and colleagues. This meant that men who thought they were surrounded by allies and friends were actually in the middle of enemies. A particularly cruel example occurred in late May 1981. Shortly after the deaths of Bontade and Inzerillo, 6 members of their families were invited to a meeting by someone they trusted. A supposed ally, this friend had secretly allied with Riina. The 6 men went to the meeting expecting a strategy session on how to respond to the murders of their bosses. Instead, they walked into an ambush. All 6 disappeared. Their bodies were never found. One man who didn't attend that fatal meeting was Emanuele D'Agostino. Suspicious of the circumstances, he instead sought refuge with Rosario Riccobono, one of Bontade's oldest and most trusted allies, a powerful boss in his own right. But Riccobono had also secretly allied with Riina. D'Agostino and his son were murdered, their trust exploited in the cruelest possible way. The only survivor of the 6 men originally targeted was Salvatore Contorno, who managed to escape the death squad sent to kill him and went into hiding. While on the run, Contorno began sending anonymous letters to the police, providing them with crucial information about the war. This information was extremely valuable to authorities who, like the losing mafia factions, had struggled to understand the complex web of loyalties and betrayals defining the conflict. By late 1983, the Second Mafia War was effectively over. The Corleonesi had won a total victory. Their primary enemies were dead or in exile. Entire mafia families had been wiped out or taken over. The Sicilian Mafia Commission was now controlled by Riina and his allies. He had become what previous bosses had wanted, but never achieved. The Capo di Capi, the boss of bosses, with nearly absolute power over Cosa Nostra. But Riina wasn't satisfied with merely defeating his enemies. He now turned on his allies, one by one. Those who had helped him win the war were themselves eliminated. Rosario Riccobono, who had betrayed D'Agostino and so many others, was murdered along with a dozen members of his clan In November 1982, Filippo Marcase, who had run the notorious Room of Death, was killed. Giuseppe Greco, the prolific assassin who had personally murdered Bontade and Inzerillo, was murdered in 1985. The logic was coldly practical. These men had helped Riina achieve power, but they were also dangerous, capable, ruthless, and possibly ambitious. They knew too much about Riina's operations and methods, and they might someday decide they wanted to rule themselves. Far better, from Riina's perspective, to get rid of them while he held the upper hand. This pattern of using people to achieve his goals and then throwing them away would continue throughout Riina's reign. Loyalty in his way of thinking only flowed upward. He expected absolute loyalty from his followers, but felt no duty in return himself. If killing an ally served his interests, he killed without hesitation or regret. By 1984, Salvatore Riina sat at the top of a criminal empire. The Corleonesi controlled most of the Sicilian mafia, and through it they had influence over heroin trafficking routes, construction rackets, extortion networks, and many other criminal businesses. The money flowing through these operations was enormous. Estimates suggest hundreds of millions of dollars every year. But Riina's position, while powerful, was also shaky. He had achieved control through violence so extreme that it had drawn never-before-seen attention from law enforcement. The Second Mafia War had been impossible to ignore, even for a traditionally corrupt and ineffective Italian justice system. Bodies were piling up at a rate that demanded some response. Moreover, Riina's methods had created a new phenomenon. The Pentito, the mafia turncoat who cooperated with authorities. Traditionally, omerta had been sacred. Few would even think of breaking the code of silence. But Riina's careless violence had changed that thinking. When a man knows he will be killed regardless of his loyalty, when he watches former allies and even family members murdered on mere suspicion, the reason to stay silent decreases. Salvatore Contorno, who had narrowly escaped death in 1981, became one of the first important Pentiti. His testimony gave authorities an unprecedented look into the inner workings of Cosa Nostra. He was followed by Tommaso Buscetta, a high-ranking mafioso who had been living in Brazil when the war erupted. Buscetta had lost many family members and associates to Riina's purges. In 1984, after his extradition to Italy, he made the historic decision to cooperate with investigating magistrate Giovanni Falcone. Buscetta's testimony was revolutionary. For the first time, a mafioso of significant rank and knowledge was willing to explain how Cosa Nostra actually worked. Its organizational structure, its rituals, its decision-making processes, and most importantly, the identities of its members. This information would prove crucial in the coming battle between the Italian state and the mafia. During the early 1980s, the Sicilian mafia was at the center of one of the largest drug trafficking operations in history. The so-called Pizza Connection case, investigated simultaneously in Italy and the United States, revealed the shocking scale of the heroin trade. Turkish morphine base was shipped to Sicily, where it was refined into heroin in secret labs. The finished product was then smuggled to the United States, where it was distributed through a network of pizza parlors and other Italian businesses. Between 1975 and 1984, this network moved an estimated $16 billion worth of heroin, an astronomical sum for that time. The Corleonesi, under Riina's leadership, controlled much of this trade. The profits were invested in legal businesses, real estate, and construction projects. Sicily in the 1980s experienced a construction boom with money from drug trafficking being laundered through building contracts. The Mafia's economic power was reaching levels never seen before, and Riina sat at the center of this empire. But with great wealth came great risk. American law enforcement, particularly the FBI and D, were targeting the heroin network. Italian authorities, pushed by the revelations of Pentiti like Buscetta, were beginning to build cases that could actually threaten the Mafia's top levels. The old system of political protection was falling apart. The violence of the Second Mafia War had made it politically impossible for politicians to be seen as weak on organized crime. Riina's victory in the Second Mafia War came at a cost that would eventually prove deadly to his rule. The sheer scale of the violence had fundamentally changed the relationship between the Mafia and Sicilian society. In earlier times, many Sicilians had viewed the Mafia with a mix of fear and grudging respect. They might not approve of it, but they understood it as part of their cultural landscape. The Second Mafia War changed this. The bodies piling up in Palermo's streets, the disappearances, the sense that the island was falling into chaos. All of this began to eat away at the Mafia's traditional base of social support. More Sicilians were willing to speak out, to cooperate with police, to challenge the code of omerta that had protected the organization for generations. Additionally, Riina had created a new kind of mafia, one focused almost exclusively on gaining power and wealth through violence. The old justifications that the Mafia provided order, protected the weak, embodied traditional Sicilian values, sounded increasingly hollow under Riina. Cosa Nostra was revealed as what it had perhaps always been, a criminal business driven by greed and maintained through terror. Within the organization itself, Riina's methods had created widespread resentment and fear. Many mafiosi who had survived the war lived in constant anxiety, knowing that Riina's paranoia meant anyone could be targeted next. The traditional mafia values of honor and respect had been replaced by pure fear. Men didn't follow Riina because they believed in him or his vision. They followed because the alternative was death. Despite his immense power, Riina remained a fugitive, unable to show his face in public or take part in normal social activities. He moved constantly between safe houses in Palermo, always accompanied by bodyguards, always watchful for signs of police surveillance or betrayal from within. Yet he kept a surprisingly normal family life during these years. His wife Ninetta and their children lived with him in these safe houses. The children attended school under false names. The family celebrated holidays and birthdays together. Photos from this time, which would only come out after Riina's arrest, show a middle-aged man who could be any Italian father, slightly bald, ordinary features, dressed in casual clothes, smiling at family gatherings. This normality was kept up through a network of loyal supporters who provided housing, ran errands, and served as messengers with the outside world. Riina couldn't go to a restaurant, couldn't attend church, couldn't be seen in public. But within the walls of his safe houses, he lived as comfortably as any wealthy Sicilian, his needs taken care of by an organization that controlled significant parts of the island's economy. His communication with his followers was done through a complex system of messengers and coded messages. He would write instructions on small pieces of paper, pizzini, which would be delivered by trusted couriers. This system allowed him to keep control while reducing the risk of electronic surveillance or direct contact that might lead to his capture. Throughout the mid-1980s, despite the increased attention from law enforcement, the Corleonesi machine continued its operations. The heroin trade continued, though it was increasingly targeted by authorities. The traditional rackets, extortion, loan sharking, control of public contracts, remained highly profitable. Construction in particular was a gold mine, with the Mafia taking cuts from almost every building project in western Sicily. But Riina was facing a new threat, one more dangerous than any rival Mafia family, the Italian state, in the form of two magistrates named Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. In February 1986, in a specially built bunker courthouse in Palermo, the largest criminal trial in Italian history began. 475 defendants, the cream of the Sicilian Mafia, sat in steel cages as prosecutors laid out their case. The trial would last nearly 2 years and would represent the most serious threat the Mafia had ever faced from the Italian justice system. The trial was the result of years of work by Giovanni Falcone, a Palermo magistrate who had dedicated his career to fighting organized crime. Falcone was a Sicilian himself, born and raised in Palermo, and he understood the Mafia in ways that outsiders never could. He was methodical, brilliant, and completely fearless. Working alongside Falcone was Paolo Borsellino, his childhood friend and fellow magistrate. Together, they had built their case using the testimony of Tommaso Buscetta and other Pentiti, combined with years of financial records, wiretaps, and traditional police work. For the first time, prosecutors were charging Mafia members not just with individual crimes, but with being part of a criminal association, a legal strategy that allowed them to target the organization itself. The Maxi Trial was a media sensation. Every day, newspapers and television broadcasts covered the proceedings, bringing the reality of Mafia violence into Italian living rooms. The defendants sat in their cages, many of them well-dressed and defiant, others looking like the peasants they had been before the Mafia made them rich. Among the accused were most of the major Corleonesi leaders, including Salvatore Riina, though he was being tried in his absence since he remained a fugitive on December 16, 1987. After months of deliberations, the verdict came down. It was devastating for the Mafia. 360 defendants were found guilty. 19 received life sentences, including Riina. The sentences totaled 2,665 years in prison. It was the most significant blow the Italian state had ever landed against organized crime. The convictions sent shockwaves through Cosa Nostra. Many mafiosi had believed their political connections would protect them, that the trial was mostly for show and would result in acquittals or light sentences. Instead, they faced the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in prison. But the legal battle wasn't over. Italian law allowed for multiple levels of appeals, and the Mafia's lawyers immediately began the process of challenging the convictions. Meanwhile, Riina and his associates began planning their response. The Maxi Trial had proven that the Italian state, given enough will and resources, could seriously threaten the organization. This could not be allowed to stand. The decision Riina made in response to the Maxi Trial would prove to be the greatest mistake of his criminal career. Rather than accepting the verdicts and keeping a low profile, waiting for the public attention to fade as it had in the past, Riina decided to wage war against the Italian state itself. The strategy was based on Riina's fundamental belief that enough violence could overcome any opposition. He believed that by striking at the heart of the justice system, by killing the magistrates and officials who were targeting the Mafia, he could scare the state into backing down. It was the same approach that had worked against rival Mafia families. Why wouldn't it work against the government? What Riina failed to understand was that killing rival mafiosi was fundamentally different from killing representatives of the Italian state. Mafia violence against other criminals could be ignored or played down by politicians. But attacks on prosecutors, judges, and law enforcement officials were attacks on the state's right to rule itself. They demanded a response not out of moral outrage, but out of political necessity. The campaign began in 1982, even before the Maxi Trial had started, but it escalated dramatically in the years that followed. On April 30th, 1982, Pio La Torre, a member of the Italian Parliament and secretary of the Sicilian Communist Party, was murdered in Palermo. La Torre had been a strong voice for stronger anti-mafia laws and had proposed legislation that would have given prosecutors powerful new tools to target organized crime. His killing was meant to send a message: stay out of mafia business. Instead, it had the opposite effect. La Torre's murder brought together support for the very anti-mafia laws he had supported. Within months, the legislation was passed, including provisions that would later be used with devastating effect in the Maxi Trial. On September 3, 1982, General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa was assassinated in Palermo. Dalla Chiesa was a national hero, a carabinieri general who had successfully fought the Red Brigade's terrorist organization. He had been sent to Sicily as the prefect of Palermo, specifically to fight the mafia. His murder, along with that of his wife and bodyguard, shocked Italy. The killing of Dalla Chiesa was a particularly bold act. The general and his wife were shot down in their car on a busy Palermo street. The hit squad, which included Giuseppe Greco and other Corleonesi killers, carried out the attack with military precision, firing over 100 rounds before speeding away on motorcycles. The public outcry following Dalla Chiesa's murder was unprecedented. The general had been a symbol of the state's determination to fight the mafia, and his assassination was seen as a direct challenge to Italy itself. Rather than scaring the authorities, the killing hardened their resolve. Despite the negative reaction to Dalla Chiesa's murder, Riina continued his campaign against the state. Throughout the 1980s, law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and even politicians seen as problematic were targeted. Some were murdered. Others received threats that forced them to live under constant guard. On July 29, 1983, Rocco Chinichi, the chief investigating magistrate in Palermo and Falcone's mentor, was killed by a car bomb that also took the lives of 2 bodyguards and the apartment building's doorman. The use of a large bomb in a residential area marked an escalation in the mafia's methods and its willingness to accept civilian deaths. In 1988, Judge Alberto Giacomelli, who had presided over an important mafia trial, was assassinated. In 1990, Judge Rosario Livatino was murdered in Sicily. Each killing was intended to scare, to show that no one who opposed the mafia was safe. But each killing also strengthened public support for anti-mafia efforts. The Italian people were beginning to realize that the mafia wasn't just a Sicilian problem or a criminal issue. It was a threat to democracy itself, an organization that believed it could murder judges and prosecutors and get away with it. Throughout this time, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino continued their work. Now, with bodyguards always at their sides, both men knew they were targets. They received death threats regularly. They lived under conditions of extreme security, their movements carefully planned, their routes constantly changed. Falcone, in particular, had become the public face of Italy's anti-mafia efforts. His success in the Maxi Trial had made him famous, but it had also made him Riina's primary target. Falcone knew this. When asked about the danger, he would quote an old Sicilian proverb: "If you want to live long in Sicily, you should live as if you're already dead." In 1986, Falcone married his longtime partner, Francesca Morvillo, who was also a judge. It was a small ceremony conducted under tight security. The couple knew their time together might be short. Meanwhile, appeals of the Maxi Trial convictions were working their way through the Italian court system. In 1990, the first appellate court upheld most of the convictions. A significant victory, but there was one more level of appeal remaining. The Italian Supreme Court. The decision was expected in early 1992. On January 30th, 1992, Italy's highest court issued its ruling on the Maxi Trial appeals. The Supreme Court upheld the convictions. The verdict was final. There would be no more appeals. No more legal delays. Hundreds of mafiosi, including many of Riina's closest associates, would be going to prison for life for the mafia. This was a life-or-death crisis. The organization's traditional strategy of using legal delays, bribing officials, and scaring witnesses had failed. The convictions were standing. The Corleonesi's most powerful leaders would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Riina's response was to escalate the violence to never-before-seen levels. If the Italian state wouldn't back down in the face of targeted assassinations, he would show them what real terror looked like. He would strike at Falcone and Borsellino, the two magistrates, who more than anyone else had brought about the mafia's legal defeat. And he would do it in a way that would be impossible to ignore. The murder of Giovanni Falcone would require very careful planning. Falcone was one of the most heavily guarded individuals in Italy. He traveled in armored cars. His routes were kept secret, and he was constantly surrounded by bodyguards. Traditional mafia assassination methods, a gunman on a motorcycle, a shooting in a public place, wouldn't work. Riina gave the task to Giovanni Brusca, a particularly ruthless Corleonesi operative who had already proven his abilities with numerous murders. Brusca put together a team and began studying Falcone's movements. Looking for weak points, Falcone lived in Rome, but frequently traveled to Sicily to visit family and continue his anti-mafia work. The trip typically involved flying to Palermo, then driving along the A29 highway to the city. Brusca realized that this highway route represented Falcone's most vulnerable mint. On the highway, Falcone's convoy would be traveling at high speed, following a predictable path with limited options for escape. The plan that came together was bold and horrifying. They would plant a massive bomb along the highway and set it off as Falcone's convoy passed. The technical challenges were significant. How to dig a space under the highway without being noticed. How to position the explosives for maximum effect. How to make sure it went off at exactly the right moment. But Brusca and his team methodically worked through each problem. May 23, 1992. It was a Saturday afternoon, warm and sunny. The kind of perfect spring day that Sicily is famous for. Giovanni Falcone and his wife Francesca Morvillo had been in Rome, but decided to fly to Palermo for the weekend to visit Falcone's mother and spend some time at their beach house. The decision to travel had been made at the last minute, a security measure meant to make Falcone's movements unpredictable. But the mafia had informants everywhere, including within law enforcement agencies and even at the airport. Word of Falcone's arrival quickly reached Brusca and his team. As Falcone's plane landed in Palermo, the conspirators took their positions. Near the town of Capaci, beneath the A29 highway, sat an oil drum packed with over 500 kilograms of military-grade explosive. More than half a ton, the bomb had been placed in a drainage channel beneath the road and covered over. Invisible to passing vehicles, a wire ran from the bomb to a nearby house where Brusca waited with a detonator. Falcone's convoy consisted of 3 cars. The lead car carried bodyguards from the police escort. The middle car, a white Fiat Croma, carried Falcone, his wife, and his driver, Giuseppe Costanza. The third car carried more bodyguards. All 3 vehicles were armored, designed to withstand gunfire and small explosions. As the convoy approached Capaci at approximately 5:58 p.m., traveling at high speed, Brusca watched through binoculars from the window of the safe house. He waited for the precise moment when the lead car passed over the bomb location, then pushed the button. The explosion was catastrophic. It created a crater in the highway over 30 feet wide and 6 feet deep. The lead car was blown apart, killing bodyguards Antonio Montanaro, Rocco DeCillo, and Vito Schifani instantly. Falcone's car was thrown into the air by the blast. The explosion was heard for miles around, a thunderous boom that echoed across the Sicilian countryside. When Falcone's car crashed back to the ground, it had been catastrophically damaged despite its armor. Falcone was critically injured, his legs crushed. His wife Francesca was also gravely wounded. Rescuers who arrived at the scene described a vision of hell: twisted metal, smoke, scattered debris, and the bodies of the dead and dying. Giovanni Falcone died in the hospital less than an hour later. His wife, Francesca, died shortly after. 3 bodyguards who had given their lives trying to protect him were dead. The judge who had done more than anyone to fight the Mafia was gone, killed along the very highway he had traveled countless times before. The reaction to the Capaci bombing was unlike anything that had come before. Falcone wasn't just a magistrate. He had become a symbol of Italy's fight against the Mafia. His murder, along with that of his wife and murdered guards, shocked the nation into a state of collective rage and grief. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Palermo for the funeral. The procession stretched for miles. People who had lived their entire lives under the Mafia's shadow openly wept and shouted insults at Cosa Nostra. Sheets hanging from balconies bore messages: Palermo demands truth. Death to the Mafia. The traditional Sicilian code of silence was breaking down in the face of such outrageous violence. Politicians who had previously been unsure about anti-Mafia efforts suddenly found their voices. The Italian parliament passed emergency legislation, giving law enforcement expanded powers. Military troops were sent to Sicily to support police operations. The Mafia had finally provoked the full anger of the Italian state, but Riina wasn't finished. If killing Falcone had caused this reaction, he reasoned, then the state needed to be taught an even harsher lesson. The violence had to continue until the government backed down. Less than 2 months after Capaci, the Mafia struck again. Paolo Borsellino had been devastated by his friend's murder. The 2 magistrates had grown up together in Palermo, had attended the same schools, had dedicated their careers to the same cause. Falcone's death hit Borsellino like a personal blow, but rather than retreating, he threw himself even more deeply into his work. Borsellino knew he was next on the Mafia's list. He made no secret of this knowledge. In interviews following Capaci, he spoke openly about the fact that he would likely be killed. But he refused to stop working, refused to be intimidated. "I will continue to do my duty until the end," he told a reporter. "After me, others will come." The planning for Borsellino's murder proceeded even more quickly than Falcone's had. Riina wanted to strike while the public was still reeling from Capaci, to drive home the message that the Mafia could kill and get away with it. July 19, 1992. It was a Sunday afternoon. Paolo Borsellino had spent the day in his apartment in Rome, working on various cases despite it being the weekend. In the late afternoon, he decided to visit his mother, who lived in Palermo. He took a commercial flight to Sicily, accompanied by his security detail. At approximately 4:45 p.m., Borsellino's motorcade pulled up outside his mother's apartment building on Via D'Amelio, a quiet residential street in Palermo as was his custom. Borsellino was planning to visit alone while his bodyguards waited in the cars parked on the street. But a Fiat 126, a small car, had been parked on Via D'Amelio for several days. Positioned directly in front of the apartment building, residents had noticed it, but thought nothing of it. Cars were often parked on the street. Inside the Fiat's trunk were 90 kilograms of explosives, packed with shrapnel to increase casualties. As Borsellino's car pulled up and he began to exit, someone watching from a nearby location pressed a button on a remote detonator. The Fiat exploded with tremendous force, the blast channeled by the narrow street and the buildings on either side, creating a devastating wave of pressure and shrapnel. Paolo Borsellino was killed instantly, literally torn apart by the explosion. 5 of his bodyguards, Agostino Catalano, Emanuela Loi, Vincenzo Limulli, Walter Eddie Cosina, and Claudio Treno also died. Emanuela Loi was the first female member of the Italian police to die in the line of duty. She was 24 years old. The street looked like a war zone. Cars were destroyed, windows shattered for blocks around. The Fiat that had contained the bomb was simply gone, vaporized by the explosion. Borsellino's mother, hearing the blast from her apartment above, rushed to the window and looked down to see the carnage below, realizing immediately what had happened. If Riina thought the Borsellino murder would scare the Italian state into giving up, he had catastrophically misjudged. Instead, it produced the opposite effect. Italy erupted in outrage. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino, coming so close together, had crossed a line that even previous violence had not. The Italian government's response was unprecedented. Thousands of additional soldiers and police were sent to Sicily. The military patrolled the streets of Palermo and other major cities. New anti-mafia legislation was rushed through Parliament, giving prosecutors and police powers they had never had before. The wall of omerta that had protected the mafia for generations began to crumble as more and more mafiosi, seeing which way the wind was blowing, decided to cooperate with authorities. The killings had also turned away much of the mafia's traditional support base. Many mafiosi, particularly from the old guard, believed Riina had gone too far. Attacking judges was one thing, but the bombings had killed many innocent people, bodyguards who were just doing their jobs. And in subsequent attacks that followed, even civilians. This broke traditional mafia codes and was bringing heat down on everyone in the organization. Within Cosa Nostra, whispers began that Riina's strategy was suicidal, that he was leading the organization to destruction. But no one dared say these concerns openly. The beast of Corleone had proven time and again that the penalty for disloyalty was death. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino were the most spectacular, but they weren't the only attacks. Through the summer and fall of 1992 and into 1993, the Mafia continued its campaign. Businessmen who refused to pay extortion money were killed. Police officers were targeted. Informants and their families were hunted down. In 1993, the violence expanded to mainland Italy. Bombs exploded in Rome, Florence, and Milan, targeting cultural landmarks and causing civilian deaths. The Florence bombing on May 27, 1993, killed 5 people and damaged the Uffizi Gallery, one of Italy's most important art museums. These attacks were meant to terrorize the entire nation, to show that nowhere was safe from Riina's reach. But each attack further isolated the Mafia and strengthened the state's resolve. The bombings had transformed the fight against the Mafia from a regional Sicilian issue into a national priority. Resources poured into anti-Mafia operations. International cooperation increased as other countries recognized at Cosa Nostra represented a threat that crossed borders. And most importantly, information was flowing into law enforcement at an unprecedented rate. The Pentiti, encouraged by the state's newfound determination, were providing details about mafia operations, hideouts, and plans. The net around Salvatore Riina was closing, though he didn't yet realize it. For nearly a quarter century, Salvatore Riina had been Italy's most wanted fugitive. His face appeared on wanted posters throughout Sicily and mainland Italy. The government had offered large rewards for information leading to his arrest. Yet, he had avoided capture year after year, living in Palermo while authorities searched for him. How had he managed this feat? The answer lay in the Mafia's deep connections in Sicilian society and, more disturbingly, its infiltration of law enforcement itself. Riina had informants within the police and Carabinieri who would warn him of planned operations. He had a network of safe houses, moving constantly to avoid being found. And he had the protection of Omerta. Most Sicilians who knew or suspected where he was would never dream of telling the authorities. But by late 1992, the situation had changed dramatically. The Capaci and Via d'Amelio bombings had shifted public opinion decisively against the Mafia. People who might previously have looked the other way were now willing to cooperate with police. The flow of information from Pentiti had increased to a flood, and law enforcement agencies had been given new resources and legal tools to pursue their investigations. One Pentito in particular proved crucial: Baldassare Di Maggio, a mafioso who had served as one of Riina's drivers and bodyguards. Di Maggio began cooperating with authorities in late 1992, and his detailed knowledge of Riina's movements, habits, and safe houses proved extremely valuable. Through the fall of 1992 and into early 1993, investigators from the Carabinieri's ROS, Special Operations Group, worked to pinpoint Riina's location. They knew he was in Palermo, but the city was large, and Riina's security precautions were sophisticated. They couldn't simply raid every possible safe house. Such an approach would tip him off, and he would disappear again. Instead, they used patient surveillance, watching suspected Corleonesi associates and tracking their movements. They installed listening devices and monitored phone calls. They followed Di Maggio's leads and checked them against information from other Pentiti. Slowly, piece by piece, they put together a picture of Riina's current routine. By early January 1993, they believed they had narrowed down Riina's location to a specific neighborhood in Palermo. More importantly, they had identified his regular routes and movements. Despite his precautions, Riina kept certain patterns: visiting family members, meeting with associates, traveling to specific locations. These patterns, once identified, made him open to capture. The operation to catch Riina was planned with very careful attention. The ROS team, led by Captain Sergio DiCaprio, who used the code name Ultimo, would have only one chance. If they moved too early and Riina escaped, he might not surface again for years. If they waited too long, he might slip away. The timing had to be perfect. It was a cold Friday morning in Palermo. Salvatore Riina, accompanied by his longtime driver and bodyguard, Salvatore Biondino, left one of his safe houses and got into a white Citroen ZX. They were headed to another location in the city for a meeting. What Riina didn't know was that Carabinieri surveillance teams had been tracking his movements for days. They knew the car, knew the routes, and knew that this morning Riina would be vulnerable. As the Citroen drove through the streets of Palermo, it was followed at a distance by multiple surveillance vehicles. Captain DiCaprio and his team waited at a pre-arranged location, ready to intercept. The plan was to stop the car at a point where escape would be impossible, where Riina would have no option but to give up. At approximately 9 o'clock a.m., on Via Bernini in the Palermo neighborhood, the Carabinieri made their move. Multiple vehicles suddenly surrounded the Citroen. Boxing it in, armed officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting for the people in the car to get out with their hands visible. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then the doors of the Citroen opened, and two middle-aged men stepped out, hands raised. One was Biondino, whom the Carabinieri quickly identified. The other was a short, balding man in a dark jacket, wearing glasses, looking completely ordinary. Salvatore Riina? One of the officers asked. Yes, the man replied quietly. After 23 years, one of the most intensive manhunts in Italian history had ended. Not in a dramatic shootout or desperate chase, but in a quiet moment on a Palermo street, the beast of Corleone, the man who had ordered over 1,000 murders, who had terrorized Sicily for decades, had been caught while simply driving to a meeting. The arrest scene was almost comically undramatic. Riina didn't resist, didn't try to run, didn't even raise his voice. He stood calmly as officers handcuffed him, asking only that he not be hurt. His manner was that of a tired old man accepting the unavoidable, not a criminal mastermind whose organization had waged war against the Italian state. As Riina was led to a police vehicle, Captain DiCaprio said what would become famous words. La Madonna è finita. The curse is over. For many Sicilians watching the arrest unfold on television, it seemed almost too good to be true. Salvatore Riina, the ghost who had haunted Sicily for a generation, was finally in custody. The man in handcuffs bore little resemblance to the fearsome reputation that went before him. At 62, Riina looked like any other elderly Sicilian. Short, overweight, with thinning gray hair and an unremarkable face. He wore ordinary clothes. His glasses gave him an almost scholarly appearance. There was nothing in his physical presence that suggested the capacity for the violence he had ordered. This disconnect between appearance and reality would become one of the most frequently commented upon aspects of Riina's arrest. How could this ordinary-looking man be responsible for such extraordinary evil? The philosopher Hannah Arendt's phrase, "the banality of evil," seemed perfectly fitting. Riina proved that monsters don't always look monstrous. Sometimes they look like everyone else. Following Riina's arrest, investigators searched his most recent safe house on Via Bernini. What they found provided interesting insights into how he had lived during his years underground. The apartment was modest but comfortable, not the luxurious hideout one might expect for a boss of Riina's stature. There were family photos on the walls, including pictures of his children. Personal letters revealed that Riina had kept close ties with his family throughout his time as a fugitive. Investigators also found the famous pizzini, small handwritten notes that Riina had used to send orders to his followers. These notes, written on tiny scraps of paper in careful handwriting, showed how Riina had kept operational control over Cosa Nostra while in hiding. They contained orders for murders, instructions for drug shipments, decisions about territorial disputes, all in Riina's own hand. Perhaps most chillingly, they found lists of targets, names of prosecutors, judges, politicians, and police officials marked for death. Some names had been crossed off, meaning missions completed. Others remained. A grim reminder of Riina's plans to continue the terror campaign had he not been caught. News of Riina's arrest spread across Italy within minutes. Television programs were interrupted with breaking news bulletins. Newspapers prepared special editions. The story dominated every news outlet in the country. The arrest of Italy's most wanted fugitive was a national event, watched and discussed by millions. The photographs of Riina in custody were distributed worldwide within hours. They showed a seemingly unremarkable elderly man, slightly overweight with thinning hair and glasses. He looked like someone's grandfather, not the beast of Corleone who had terrorized Sicily for decades. This jarring disconnect between appearance and reputation became a focal point of media coverage. In Sicily, the reaction was complex and emotional. Many celebrated, seeing the arrest as proof that justice could win, even against the most powerful criminals. Church bells rang in some towns. People hung Italian flags from their balconies in a show of support for the rule of law. But there was also skepticism. Riina had been living openly in Palermo for years, protected by a network of supporters. Why had he been caught now? Some wondered whether there were political motivations behind the timing for the families of Riina's victims. The arrest brought mixed emotions, relief that he was finally in custody, but also the painful knowledge that it had come too late for their loved ones. Giovanni Falcone's sister, Maria, spoke for many when she said that Riina's capture couldn't bring her brother back. But at least he wouldn't be able to order any more murders immediately following his arrest. Salvatore Riina was placed under the Article 41 bis prison regime, Italy's harshest form of imprisonment, introduced after the Mafia's campaign of violence. 41 bis was designed specifically to stop imprisoned Mafia bosses from continuing to run their organizations from behind bars. The conditions were severe. Riina spent 22 hours each day, locked in his cell with no contact with other prisoners, and no access to books or reading materials beyond a strictly limited selection. Visits from family members took place behind glass partitions with no physical contact. Communication was done via phone and monitored by authorities. The isolation was nearly total. Phone calls were not allowed. Television and radio were forbidden. All letters were read and censored by prison officials. The few hours outside his cell were spent in a small exercise yard alone under constant watch. The regime was designed not just to punish, but to completely cut off any ability to communicate with the outside criminal organization. Riina was initially held in maximum security facilities on remote Italian islands. First on the island of Fasano, then Asinara, where geographic isolation added another layer of security. These island prisons had been specifically chosen to hold the most dangerous Mafia prisoners, making escape almost impossible and limiting chances for contact with mainland associates. While Riina had been found guilty in his absence during the Maxi Trial in 1987, his physical presence in custody allowed for additional prosecutions. Over the following years, he faced trial after trial for murders and other crimes that prosecutors had documented but not yet brought to court. The first major post-arrest trial took place in 1993, just months after his capture. Riina was charged with being the mastermind behind the Capaci and Via d'Amelio bombings. The evidence was overwhelming, much of it provided by Pentiti, who had taken part in the attacks or been part of the planning. Giovanni Brusca, who had personally set off the Capaci bomb, testified in detail about Riina's orders and the careful planning of both assassinations. The trial was held in a specially built bunker courthouse, a result of the Maxi Trial, designed to prevent escape attempts or attacks by Riina's supporters. Security was extraordinary. Military personnel surrounded the building. Snipers were positioned on rooftops, and all attendees, including lawyers and journalists, were subjected to thorough searches. Riina's behavior in court was defiant. He refused to accept the legitimacy of the proceedings, often sitting with his arms crossed, looking bored or scornful when asked questions. He often used his right to remain silent. He showed no regret, no emotion when the names of his victims were read aloud, no reaction when survivors and family members testified about the devastation he had caused. The verdicts came quickly. Guilty on all counts, life sentence. The pattern repeated over subsequent years as more trials proceeded. By the end of the 1990s, Riina had been found guilty of dozens of murders and given multiple life sentences. Italian law doesn't add up life sentences the way some systems do, but the number, eventually reaching 26 life sentences, served as a measure of the scope of his crimes. Despite the harsh conditions and multiple convictions, Riina kept his position as a feared figure, even in prison. His reputation alone was enough to command a certain level of respect, even fear from other inmates on the rare occasions when he encountered them. Prison guards described him as quiet, controlled, keeping the same iron discipline he had shown throughout his criminal career. He refused to cooperate with authorities or show any regret for his actions. When investigators and prosecutors tried to question him, seeking information about unsolved murders or the locations of missing persons' bodies, he blocked them. The code of omerta that he had lived by for his entire adult life remained unbroken. He would die before talking, and everyone knew it. His family remained loyal. His wife Ninetta visited him regularly within the strict limits of the 41 bis regime, speaking to him through glass barriers under the watchful eyes and ears of prison officials. His children also visited, though their own lives had been deeply marked by their father's notoriety and criminal activities. Both of Riina's sons followed him into the mafia and into prison. Giovanni Riina received a life sentence in 2001 for involvement in 4 murders. Giuseppe Riina was also found guilty on mafia-related charges. The family's criminal legacy continued, even as its patriarch sat in a maximum security cell. Over the years, a few interviews and statements from Riina leaked out or were officially allowed, giving rare glimpses into his mindset. These moments revealed an unrepentant man who saw himself not as a criminal, but as someone who had lived by his own code in a hypocritical society. In one recorded conversation with his son, Riina was heard saying that he had no regrets about his life. He believed he had done what was necessary to survive and do well in the world he lived in. When asked about the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, he showed no regret, viewing them as enemies who had attacked his organization and therefore deserved their fate. In 2013, during a court appearance, Riina shouted death threats at prosecutor Nino Di Matteo, showing that even at 82 years old, and after 2 decades in maximum security, the beast still had fangs. The incident reinforced why the 41 bis regime was necessary. Even from his cell, Riina remained dangerous. Psychological profiles tried to understand the mind of a man capable of such widespread violence. Experts noted his ability to separate things, to be a loving family man in one setting and a merciless killer in another. They observed his extreme narcissism, his inability or unwillingness to feel for victims, his view of violence as simply a tool to reach goals. Some compared him to historical dictators and tyrants, men who could order mass death without apparent emotional cost. But trying to explain Riina by saying he was crazy missed something important. He wasn't insane or psychologically abnormal in clinical terms. He was a product of a specific cultural and criminal environment. Someone who had taken in certain values and beliefs about power, loyalty, and violence, and then followed those values with exceptional ruthlessness and ability. Understanding him meant understanding the system that had created him. In June 2002, some 300 Mafia prisoners started a hunger strike, calling for an end to the isolation conditions required by Article 41 bis. The protest began in the L'Aquila prison, where Riina was held, and spread rapidly across the country, despite prisoners supposedly having no way to contact one another. The coordination of the strike itself seemed to prove the regime's limits, somehow even under total surveillance. The imprisoned mafiosi could still communicate and organize group action. The strike drew international attention and criticism. Human rights organizations questioned whether the 41 bis conditions amounted to cruel and unusual punishment or even torture. Critics pointed out that prisoners were denied basic comforts and held in conditions of extreme isolation for years, sometimes decades, with no clear end point unless they agreed to cooperate with authorities. Defenders of the system argued that exceptional criminals required exceptional measures. The imprisoned mafia bosses weren't ordinary criminals. They were the leaders of skilled criminal organizations responsible for thousands of deaths. Without strict isolation, they would continue to direct murders, extortion, and drug trafficking from their cells. The 41 bis regime, however harsh, was necessary to protect society. The European Court of Human Rights eventually ruled that parts of the regime violated the European Convention on Human Rights, though the Italian government kept the system with some changes. The debate over whether the punishment was fair and humane continued throughout Riina's imprisonment. As Riina aged, his health got worse. In 2003, he had surgery for heart problems, and in May of that year, he was hospitalized due to a heart attack. Throughout 2003 and later years, he was repeatedly admitted to hospitals for heart issues. He also developed Parkinson's disease, which slowly got worse. In 2017, Riina's lawyers asked for his release to house arrest, arguing that his worsening health made continued imprisonment inhumane. The request sparked fierce controversy. Victims' families and anti-mafia activists protested strongly, arguing that Riina had shown no mercy to his victims and deserved none himself. How could a man responsible for such suffering be shown kindness in his final days? The Italian Supreme Court initially said it would consider the request, but in the end, the decision came too late. Riina remained in custody, though he was moved to the prison ward of a hospital in Parma to receive medical treatment for cancer and other conditions. November 16, 2017, Salvatore Riina turned 87 years old in a hospital bed. Connected to machines, his body finally failing after a lifetime of robust health. He had had 2 operations for cancer in recent weeks and was now in a medically induced coma. The beast's reign was ending, not with violence or drama, but with the quiet decline that comes to all mortal flesh. The Italian Justice Ministry agreed to allow family members to visit him at his bedside, a rare exception of kindness to the strict 41 bis regime. His wife Ninetta and some of his children came to say goodbye to the man who had been husband, father, and one of history's most prolific criminals. November 17, 2017, one day after his 87th birthday, Salvatore Riina died in the prison wing of Maggiore Hospital in Parma. He was serving 26 life sentences for having ordered the deaths of more than 150 people. The specific cause of death was not officially revealed, but it was clear that age, heart disease, cancer, and Parkinson's had finally done what the Italian state and rival mafia families had failed to do for so many years. They had killed the beast. News of Riina's death spread quickly across Italy and beyond. The reactions were as complex and varied as the man's impact on history. Many Italians, particularly Sicilians, felt relief mixed with frustration. Relief that one of the nation's most notorious criminals was finally gone. but frustration that he had died of natural causes in a hospital bed, rather than facing some more dramatic or just end. He had never shown regret, never apologized, never cooperated with authorities. He had taken his secrets to the grave. Victims' families expressed mixed emotions. Some felt that justice had been served. Riina had spent nearly a quarter-century in the harshest conditions Italian law allowed before dying in custody. Others felt cheated, believing that no punishment could ever be enough for the enormity of his crimes. No sentence, however harsh, could bring back their murdered loved ones. Anti-mafia activists and prosecutors acknowledged Riina's death as a symbolic moment. He represented a particular era of mafia violence and power, an era that had slowly been worn away under steady legal and social pressure. His death marked the end of that generation of bosses. Though, of course, the mafia itself continued. There were no public celebrations, no dancing in the streets, just a quiet recognition that a dark chapter had closed. As one journalist wrote, Riina's death was less an ending and more a confirmation that time catches everyone eventually. Even monsters who had seemed untouchable for so long. Even in death, Riina caused controversy. His family wanted to bury him in Corleone, returning him to the town where his criminal career had begun. But local authorities and residents strongly objected. They didn't want Corleone, which had worked hard to shake off its mafia image and link to crime, to become a place of pilgrimage for mafia supporters visiting Riina's grave. The funeral itself was a small private affair, held in the prison with only immediate family present. There were no public services, no processions through town squares, no chance for supporters to gather and pay respects. The Italian state wanted to make sure that Riina's death didn't become a rallying point or propaganda opportunity for the remaining mafia. In the end, Riina was buried in a cemetery outside Corleone in a plot far from the center of town. His grave marker was simple, bearing only his name and dates. There would be no monument, no shrine, no celebration of his life and deeds. In death, as in the final years of his life, the Italian state sought to lessen and isolate him, to stop his memory from inspiring future criminals. The Sicily that Riina left behind when he died was deeply different from the one he had terrorized at the height of his power. The violence and chaos of the 1980s and early 1990s had pushed significant changes in Sicilian society and Italian law enforcement. The anti-mafia movement, born from the blood of Falcone, Borsellino, and countless others, had grown into a powerful social force. Organizations like Libera and Adiapiso worked to challenge the mafia's economic power and social acceptance. Schools taught children about the importance of following the law and the evils of organized crime. A generation had grown up determined not to live under the mafia's shadow. The Italian state's approach to fighting organized crime had changed dramatically. The Pentiti system, while controversial, had given crucial information that led to hundreds of arrests and convictions. The 41-bis prison regime, however harsh, had effectively broken the ability of imprisoned bosses to run their organizations from behind bars. International cooperation had made it harder for mafiosi to run away abroad and continue their operations. Economically, the mafia's power had lessened. Though not disappeared, the huge profits from the heroin trade had dried up as law enforcement cracked down on trafficking networks, while the organizations stayed involved in extortion, money laundering, and other crimes. Its wealth and influence were shadows of what they had been during Riina's prime. Culturally, Omerta had weakened significantly. More Sicilians were willing to cooperate with police, to testify in court, to break the code of silence that had protected the mafia for generations. The belief that the mafia was unbeatable, that it would always be part of Sicilian life, had been shattered. People could now imagine and work toward a Sicily free from organized crime's grip. Yet, the Mafia continued after Riina's arrest in 1993. Leadership of Cosa Nostra had passed to Bernardo Provenzano, Riina's longtime lieutenant and partner. Provenzano took a lower profile, avoiding the spectacular violence that had marked Riina's approach. He focused on rebuilding the organization's economic power and political connections while avoiding fights with the state. Provenzano was caught in 2006, continuing the pattern of eventual capture that had happened to all major mafia leaders. Later bosses like Salvatore Lo Piccolo and Matteo Messina Denaro each led the organization for periods before being arrested. Messina Denaro, who had been a fugitive since 1993, was finally caught in January 2023, ending one of the longest manhunts in Italian history. The modern Sicilian Mafia, while less powerful than its peak under Riina, remained active in various criminal activities, but it operated in a fundamentally changed environment. The social and political protection it once enjoyed had largely disappeared. Law enforcement had become more skilled and persistent, and most importantly, Sicilian society itself had turned against the organization in ways previous generations never had. In discussing Riina's legacy, it's crucial to remember that statistics about murders and violence represent real human beings. Prosecutors and judges, police officers and bodyguards, rival mafiosi and innocent bystanders, men and women, and sometimes even children, whose lives were cut short by violence ordered by one man. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino became symbols of resistance to the Mafia, their names linked with courage and dedication to justice. But they were also just two among hundreds who died. Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, the general whose assassination shocked Italy; Pio La Torre, the politician who dared to challenge Mafia power; the countless bodyguards who died doing their duty; the rival mafiosi killed during the Second Mafia War; the innocent civilians who happened to be in the wrong place when bombs exploded. Memorials throughout Sicily bear the names of Mafia victims, permanent reminders of the human cost of organized crime. Schools, streets, and public buildings have been renamed to honor those who fell fighting the Mafia. These acts of remembering serve a crucial purpose, ensuring that the victims aren't forgotten, that their sacrifices added to something larger than their individual tragedies. Organizations representing victims' families have played important roles in Italian society, standing up for justice and against any softening of anti-mafia measures. When Riina's lawyers sought his release to house arrest, these families organized to oppose it, arguing that someone who had shown no mercy deserved none in return. Their voices carry moral weight that even the most hardened criminals and their defenders cannot easily ignore. Salvatore Riina's life and criminal career offer several important lessons that extend beyond the specific situation of the Sicilian Mafia. First, the danger of allowing criminal organizations to become embedded in society. The Mafia's power grew over decades because it filled spaces left by weak government institutions, because it was tolerated or even quietly supported by parts of the political and business establishment, and because social norms like omerta protected it from being held responsible. By the time the Italian state seriously committed to fighting the Mafia, the organization had become so established that removing it required extraordinary measures and came at enormous cost. Second, the importance of steady commitment to the rule of law. The Maxi Trial and later prosecutions succeeded not because of any single, heroic individual, but because of ongoing institutional effort involving judges, prosecutors, police, politicians, and finally society as a whole. Individual heroes like Falcone and Borsellino were crucial, but lasting change required complete system change. Third, the recognition that organized crime is fundamentally a social and economic problem, not just a law enforcement issue. The mafia grew well in conditions of poverty, weak institutions, and cultural norms that put personal loyalty above public responsibility. Dealing with these root causes, while slower and less dramatic than arrests and trials, is essential for lasting solutions. Fourth, the understanding that strategies based purely on violence eventually fail. Riina's approach, overwhelming force, spectacular attacks, a strategy of terror, might have seemed effective in the short term. He got rid of his rivals, controlled his organization through fear, and scared many who might have opposed him. But in the end, his violence provoked a reaction that destroyed his power and broke apart much of what he had built. The mafia families that followed Riina generally kept lower profiles. Recognizing that his approach had been disastrously counterproductive, Riina's case raises deep questions about the nature of evil and moral responsibility. How does an ordinary person, and by all accounts, Riina was in many ways quite ordinary outside of his criminal activities, become capable of ordering hundreds of murders without apparent regret? Some explanations focus on his upbringing, the shock of losing his father and brother to violence, the poverty and harshness of his childhood, the cultural environment of rural Sicily, where the mafia was seen as normal. These factors undoubtedly shaped him, but they weren't the only causes. Many people went through similar situations without becoming mass murderers. Others emphasize his deep involvement in mafia culture from a young age. He took in values of violence, power, and omerta as basic rules of how the world worked by the time he was an adult. These had become so deeply held that he couldn't imagine operating any other way. His moral universe simply didn't include ideas like universal human rights or equal justice under law. Still others point to personality factors. The traits that made him a successful mafia boss also made him capable of extreme violence. His lack of empathy, his cruelty, his ability to view human beings as mere obstacles or tools rather than people with their own worth. These characteristics, whether inborn or developed, enabled him to do what most people simply couldn't imagine doing. Probably the truth involves all these factors and more. A complex interaction between individual psychology, cultural background, and specific circumstances. What's clear is that Riina represents an extreme case of how normal human abilities for strategic thinking, for loyalty, for determination can be twisted toward monstrous ends when guided by a fundamentally immoral value system. As of 2025, the Sicilian Mafia exists in a greatly reduced state compared to its peak under Riina's leadership. The organization still operates, still makes illegal money, still has influence in certain areas, but it is no longer the ruling force it once was in Sicilian society and economy. Law enforcement continues to target the organization aggressively. Regular arrests of suspected members and associates, seizures of assets gained through criminal activity, and ongoing surveillance operations keep constant pressure. The conviction rate in mafia trials remains high, and the willingness of some members to cooperate with authorities continues to provide information that enables further operations. The cultural shift has been perhaps even more significant than the legal crackdown. Younger Sicilians increasingly reject the mafia and the values it stands for. They see it not as a romantic band of honorable men, but as a criminal organization that has held back Sicily's development and stained its reputation. Businesses openly resist extortion, demands and cooperate with police in ways that would have been unthinkable during Riina's era. Economically, legal opportunities have replaced some of what the mafia once provided. Tourism, technology, and other industries offer paths to prosperity that don't require involvement with organized crime, while poverty and unemployment remain problems in parts of Sicily. The feeling that the mafia is the only route to power and wealth has lessened. That said, organized crime has proven remarkably able to bounce back throughout history. The mafia adapted after previous crackdowns and could possibly come back if social conditions get worse or law enforcement vigilance weakens. Constant watchfulness, as much as it sounds like a cliché, remains necessary. The victory over the mafia is not final, but ongoing, requiring continued commitment from each generation. Riina's story exists within the larger history of organized crime, not just in Sicily, but around the world. The patterns he showed, the use of violence to control territory and markets, the corruption of legal institutions, the use of weak government, appear throughout criminal organizations worldwide. In Italy, other criminal organizations, like the 'Ndrangheta, Camorra, and Sacra Corona Unita, have in many ways surpassed the Sicilian mafia in power and wealth. The 'Ndrangheta in particular, based in Calabria, has become one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations through control of cocaine, trafficking from South America to Europe. Globally, organized crime has evolved and adapted to modern conditions. International drug cartels, human trafficking networks, cybercrime syndicates, and other forms of cross-border organized crime pose challenges that in some ways exceed what the Sicilian mafia at its peak represented. These modern criminal organizations operate across borders, use technology, and make profits that make what Riina's organization got from heroin trafficking look small. Yet the basic patterns remain similar. Criminal organizations grow well where government is weak, where economic opportunities are limited, where cultural norms allow or support their activities. They gain power through violence and corruption. They destroy lives and communities in pursuit of profit. And in the end, they can be defeated only through steady, wide-ranging efforts that deal with both immediate security concerns and deeper social and economic problems. Riina's case also raises questions about justice and proper punishment for mass criminals. He spent nearly 25 years in the harshest conditions Italian law allowed, isolated from society, denied basic comforts, subjected to a system that some international observers called torture. He died in custody, never having experienced freedom after his arrest. Was this justice? From one point of view, yes, Riina was responsible for extraordinary evil. The suffering he caused can barely be counted. Not just the direct victims of murders he ordered, but their families, the witnesses damaged by violence, the whole society that lived in fear during his reign. If anyone deserved the harshest punishment available, it was him. From another point of view, questions remain. Does any punishment, however severe, really balance the scales against such crimes? Can justice ever really be achieved when hundreds of victims are dead and the perpetrator merely imprisoned? And does the harshness of the punishment risk making the punisher as morally compromised as the punished? These questions have no easy answers. They are debated by ethicists, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens trying to figure out how society should respond to extraordinary evil. Riina's case provides no final answer, but does show the complexity of the issues involved. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Salvatore Riina's story is how ordinary he was in so many ways. He wasn't a raging madman or an obviously monstrous figure. He was a short, somewhat overweight Sicilian man who loved his family, enjoyed good food, and in his daily interactions could seem quite normal. This ordinariness is itself frightening. It suggests that the ability for extreme evil doesn't require exceptional wickedness or psychological abnormality. It can come from normal human characteristics, twisted by situation, culture, and choice toward terrible ends. Riina's ability to order hundreds of murders while playing with his grandchildren speaks to a separation that many find hard to understand. But this ability may not be as rare as we'd like to believe. Throughout history, people have shown the ability to behave with normal human decency in some situations, while committing terrible acts in others. Guards at concentration camps went home to loving families. Soldiers who commit war crimes might be devoted fathers. Corporate executives who make decisions leading to mass deaths might be generous in their personal lives. Understanding this doesn't excuse or lessen the evil. Rather, it forces us to recognize that evil isn't always obvious, that ordinary-seeming people can do extraordinary harm, and that watchfulness about our own moral choices and the choices of those around us is always necessary. How will history remember Salvatore Riina? Almost certainly as one of the most ruthless and effective crime bosses in history, but also as someone whose ultimate strategy led to catastrophic failure. He achieved what few criminals ever accomplish: nearly absolute power over a skilled criminal organization, huge wealth, and the ability to literally decide who lived and who died across an entire region for a time in the 1980s and early 1990s. He was arguably one of the most powerful men in Italy, more feared than politicians or police officials. But his rule was relatively brief, and its end was total. He spent the last quarter of his life in maximum security isolation. His organization was destroyed. His strategy of attacking the state caused reactions that broke apart everything he had built. And he died in prison, his name linked not with power, but with brutality and ultimately failure. Future historians studying organized crime will certainly look at Riina's career as a case study in both criminal success and criminal overreach. They will analyze how he rose to power, how he kept control, and crucially, how his own choices led to his downfall. The lessons extend beyond criminal justice to broader questions about the limits of violence as a strategy, the importance of institutions in resisting criminal power, and the role of social factors in helping or limiting organized crime. To close, consider this in a Palermo school. Children learn about Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, about their courage in fighting the mafia, about their sacrifice. The school bears Falcone's name. In the courtyard stands a memorial listing the names of mafia victims, a permanent reminder of what was lost. The children growing up in this school will inherit a Sicily different from the one their grandparents knew. They will grow up learning that the mafia is not unavoidable, not romantic, not something to tolerate or admire. They will be taught that the rule of law matters, that courage in the face of fear matters, that individual choices matter. This is perhaps the ultimate defeat of Salvatore Riina's vision. He believed that power came from violence, that fear ensured obedience, that the mafia was eternal and unbeatable. But the Sicily rising from the ashes of his reign teaches different lessons. That justice can win, that societies can change, that evil, however powerful it seems, is ultimately temporary, while the human ability for courage and renewal lasts. The children in that Palermo school will probably barely know Riina's name. They will know Falcone and Borsellino, and that more than any prison sentence or legal conviction may be the truest measure of justice, that the heroes are remembered and celebrated, while the monster fades into deserved darkness. And so ends the story of Salvatore Riina, a man who thought himself untouchable, yet died alone in a prison cell, abandoned by the organization he'd killed to rule. His reign of terror lasted decades, but in the end, He became what every tyrant becomes. A warning story. A small note in history, remembered not for power, but for the suffering he caused, from a poverty-stricken childhood in the hills of Corleone to the absolute heights of criminal power, then to a quarter-century in maximum security isolation. Riina's life traced an arc that shows both the darkest and most hopeful aspects of human society. The darkest in showing what one ruthless individual can accomplish when not limited by conscience or law. The most hopeful in proving that even the most powerful criminals can finally be brought to justice, when society finds the courage and commitment to do so. The cost was huge. Over 1,000 dead during the Second Mafia War alone. Judges, prosecutors, police officers, politicians, men and women who dared to oppose the mafia, assassinated with bombs and bullets, entire families wiped out, a generation of Sicilians living in fear. The damage Riina caused spread outward, affecting thousands of lives, damaging an entire society. But from that suffering came change. Anti-mafia movements emerged, stronger and more determined than ever. The Italian legal system grew, developing tools to fight organized crime more effectively. Sicilian society itself changed, rejecting the code of silence and the cultural acceptance of mafia power that had enabled criminals like Riina for generations. Today, when tourists visit Palermo, they can walk streets that were once killing fields. They can visit memorials to Falcone and Borsellino, learn about the Maxi Trial, and understand what it took to defeat the beast of Corleone. The story has become part of Sicily's identity, not a shameful secret to be hidden, but a chapter of history to be acknowledged, learned from, and finally overcome. Salvatore Riina died on November 17, 2017, at age 87, without ever expressing regret for his crimes, without cooperating with authorities, keeping to the end his commitment to Omerta and his belief that he had done nothing wrong. He died as he lived, defiant, unrepentant, sure of his own rightness, even as the world judged him a monster. But monsters do fall. Power gained through violence proves temporary. Organizations built on fear and blood eventually crumble, and societies, however damaged, keep the ability to heal and change. These are the true lessons of Salvatore Riina's rise and fall. If this story kept you engaged, if you learned something new about one of history's darkest figures, if you gained understanding into the complex battle between organized crime and society's effort to establish justice, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We need your support to keep making these deep dive explorations of criminal history. Stories told properly with careful research, respect for victims, and the time needed to understand not just what happened, but why it matters. Share this with anyone fascinated by true crime, mafia history, or the psychology of evil. And tell me in the comments what surprised you most about Riina's story. Did you know about the Second Mafia War? About Falcone and Borsellino's sacrifice? About how one man's violence changed an entire nation? The conversation doesn't end here. These stories aren't just history. They're ongoing lessons about power, justice, courage, and the never-ending struggle to create societies governed by law rather than violence. Thank you for watching, wherever you are in the world. Whatever time you're listening to this, whether you're falling asleep in California or starting your day in Sydney, whether you're on a late-night drive or relaxing after work, thank you for spending these hours exploring one of the darkest chapters in modern criminal history. May you sleep peacefully, knowing that monsters like the beast eventually always fall. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice, not quickly, not easily, but inevitably when people choose courage over fear, law over violence, and truth over silence. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the price of freedom and justice is always being watchful. Good night.